That suggests we are, yes.
Thank you.
Can you see me as well as see the slides? Is that working?
Yes.
Great, okay. Okay, first, there's a simple idea that I'm going to present to you, and that is that consent is the new spam. And that might fly in the face of the discussion you've just had. I don't propose to talk about the litigation that I have and others have underway. I'll say a few words about that now to get it out of the way. First, I have litigation in Hamburg against the IAB, specifically IAB Tech Lab, which is involved in the most prominent consent system. And that is to address what I'm going to show you is a very significant data breach that makes consent meaningless. But also, I and others have a procedure, a quasi-judicial procedure in Belgium against IAB Europe. And that specifically is against the TCF, the Transparency and Consent Framework. There's not much novel in our litigation. Essentially, it uses the same objections that I've been airing since 2017, since before the system launched. So let me take you through it, because the problems of consent are not novel. They've been known for a long time, and they have very little to do with consent. Let's start off with why we have this consent system. I'm not talking here about the legal requirement. I'm talking about what happens behind the scenes every time you visit a website or app. And for you to understand this system, it's useful for us to play a hypothetical game in which all of us work for a company that is trying to sell a product. Let's imagine that we together are marketing a product and we already have customers for that product. We take the data that we have on those customers, perhaps their email addresses, and we store these data with a company called a data management platform, a DMP. Now, the DMP will very often offer us the opportunity to augment our data with other data that it can match against our, for example, email addresses, and that it can purchase on our behalf from a data broker. And that gives us a better view of our customer, which we're probably very happy to have. Now, the legality around that transaction is an entire story into itself. So let's move on. So we store our data with a DMP. Now, the most famous DMP you will be familiar with was called Cambridge Analytica. It gives you a sense of what a DMP can do. The DMP organizes the data we have about our customers and about the people we'd like to advertise to. And the main reason we do this, there are others, but the main reason is that there are auctions for people's attention on almost every commercial website and almost every app. And we want to be present at those auctions because we want to show the right person the right ad at the right time. That's what we've been told is possible. It may or may not be, but that's what we've been told, and many marketers believe it. Now, we know that we cannot be present at these auctions because there are billions of them per day. So we hire another company to act as our agent, and that company is a demand-side platform. Perhaps we don't hire it directly. Maybe our advertising agency hires it for us. The demand-side platform will participate at all of these auctions every time a page loads or an app is used. But it needs to know what kind of person does our company want to show its ads to, and how much are we willing to spend for that opportunity. In other words, if it's going to be our representative at an auction, how should it behave at the auction? What should it bid and when, and on who? So the DMP tells the DSP, here is who we're looking to target, or here are the types of people, lookalikes, for example. Here's the type of audience we want to target. Now, along comes Harsh, for example, and he loads up, maybe he loads up the Irish Independent, right? So he's doing his postdoc at Trinity College Dublin, and he's reading about Irish political news, which at the moment is quite fraught. There's a scandal happening right now. So he loads up the Irish Independent or the Irish Times or the journal.ie. And in the space of a split second, milliseconds, the editorial content is served into his browser window or is put into the app that he's using. But the rectangles around the editorial content are not yet full. And you will all know that sometimes you actually see a stutter or a pause where the ads haven't yet loaded. And sometimes when they load, they actually push, as the DOM loads, as the page loads, they actually push the content down the page or to the side. Now, what's happening is, in that case, the publisher has not directly with its own sales team or through some other means placed an ad. And instead, it contacts a supply side platform. This is the counterparty to the demand side platform. The supply side platform does something that Harsh is not aware of. He doesn't realize he is being fed into a demand. It gathers information about Harsh and it packages that information up into what is called a bid request, a request for bids for the opportunity to show Harsh an ad. And that bid request goes to at least one auction house, possibly several. You can have an auction of auctions. Each auction house then sends that bid request for the opportunity to put an ad into that specific single rectangle. Sends that request to tens or hundreds or conceivably thousands of different DSPs. Now, our company knows that it is trying to reach postdocs in Dublin, right, for some reason, with whatever its product is. And so our ad is put into the rectangle. Normally this happens in less than 200 milliseconds. And very often there's an opportunity under the table for the DMP to perform a sync. That means to update what it knows about Harsh so that it will know him better in the future. Now, a few things about this chart. First, all of those cogs are very often owned by the same companies. There are hundreds of companies involved here. There used to be thousands. There's been a lot of consolidation in the market. Very often, though, this market, both sides are run by the same companies. Second, the main impression you should take away here is that there's a lot of arrows. So for the engineers on the call, you might look at this and think this is quite elegant. You're about to be even more impressed by the system because it does have a certain brute force charm to it. I'm going to show you this system 3 more times, but far quicker now. You arrive on the dailybugle.com. The Daily Bugle tells 4 different advertising exchanges that you're present and you're reading whatever you're reading. Each advertising exchange sends a bid request about you from the Daily Bugle to 4 or 5 or 10 different DSPs. And the theory is that the right DSP will show you the right ad at the right time on behalf of one of its clients. Here's the first problem. There are many problems, but here's the first problem. Once the data leave the publisher, we've no idea where they go. There's no control at all. 0. I'm going to give you an example of a DSP that we know about. Right, so this goes back to 2018. The CNIL, the French regulator, investigated a company called Vectory, which is tiny. No one that I know in the industry, and I used to be in this industry, had ever heard of Vectory before. It had €3.5 million turnover in the preceding year. So it was a minnow, right? No one knew about it. When the CNIL, the French enforcer, visited, they found that Vectory had hoovered up 67.7 million people's data, it seems, just by sitting in on these auctions. So this gives you a sense of the kind of scale of data that even a small player has access to by sitting in on these exchanges. Now, if you go to Vectory's website, I think even today they still have this claim somewhere on their website. I think this is when you click the privacy button at the top here. And as you scroll down the claim, the page, they make some privacy claims. They say, look, we only store 30% and we dump everything after 12 months, which raises a question of scale. And I don't know the answer to this question. CNIL would. Did these guys who are tiny, did they have access to 250 million people's online behavior just by sitting in on these exchanges? It's possible that they might have. And I give you this example just to warm you up to the scale that we'll discuss in a moment. Okay, I'm going to show it to you a third time before we get into consent. Here's what happens when you go online today. You visit the website, You request the page is delivered, an ad server kicks in, sends information about you to an SSP, supply side platform, that goes to at least one ad exchange, which then broadcasts out the information to you to tens or hundreds or maybe more companies. One of them wins the auction. Under the table, there is some sort of a sync. It can happen in different ways. And then a whole lot of other stuff that isn't relevant to this conversation happens for the ad to be shown. Now, the impression I want to leave you with from this chart is that that is an awful lot of arrows. That's the main impression here. And now a fourth time, even quicker. Every time you go to a commercial website, this is what happens. You type in the website, there's a bunch of empty rectangles. Each rectangle has to be filled. If it uses this system, a bid request goes out. So what is in those bid requests? Right? What data are you giving consent to be shared here? We know this answer, it's fairly straightforward. The industry is quite open actually about what data are shared in its own technical documentation. Now there are two main standards. It's a little bit tricky here because Google has its own standard but also uses the IAB standard. So let's take a look at the IAB standard. This document, like the other one, you can find, it's on their GitHub account. You can look at it right now. If you scroll to the very end, it's about 14,000 words long. If you scroll to the very end, you'll get a summary, a very abbreviated bid request. Before we go through this, a bid request can have, in the IAB system, 595 different types or different data fields in it. This clearly doesn't. This is a very short one. Let's walk through the data. Okay, so here we're getting the domain of the website. Now, you could have the full URL. This example doesn't have it. And just to remind you what URL means, it means embarrassingwebsite.com / really awkward if people found out about a category / excruciating and unbearable private scary things article, right? That's what the full URL can mean. Now, on top of that, we're getting very specific identifiers. One of the IDs comes from the ad system itself. The other is the buyer ID. So this is where our advertiser is trying to match ahead of time based on who it knows it's trying to reach. Now we see we're dealing with a young lady. Now we've got her mobile device identifier, which Apple is in the process of doing away with. Now we've got her IP address. Google system truncates the IP address. Now we've got her user agent details, which gives us enough that we could guess we're seeing her again, even if we didn't have much else. And finally, we have where she's standing, in theory, her GPS coordinates. Now, in addition, I said there are 595 types of data. There are many other types of data. Some are benign, some are very much not benign. I'm going to give you an example. This is the content taxonomy. There are two versions. This one is still live, but is no longer promoted. This labels the kind of content that a person is currently watching or listening or reading. So even if you didn't have the URL, you could use this to get a sense of what they're looking at. And actually, some of the titles here are unbelievably irresponsible, it seems to me. So a bid request can go out about a person, including the health conditions or psychological conditions and so on, that person seems to have an interest in, including IAB 7-28, which is the code for a person who seems to have an interest in incest / abuse support, right? Someone recovering from that kind of sexual abuse. So have a think about that. Now, Google, after pressure from me, removed its content taxonomy equivalent, but it still sends out the entire URL. And clearly the URL itself is a pretty good indicator, but not always. Not all URLs do indicate, but conveniently, it is easy to automatically visit the page and extract your own tags. So sending out the URL is a problem. Now, what's the scale of this breach? We can know this by reading the marketing materials and technical documents of the main auction houses. Google will not disclose the scale for antitrust competition reasons, but they are quite a lot bigger. At a minimum, we're talking about hundreds of billions of data leaks a day. And the upshot is that everyone you've ever known, everyone you'll ever meet, everyone you'll ever come into contact with has almost certainly had their most intimate secrets leaked through this system, which is prevalent throughout the internet. Now, consent. The industry's approach to this enormous, biggest data breach ever recorded is magical geometry. Rectangles with the word UK on them. They doll it up in different ways, but that's basically what it is. It's nonsensical, supposed purported consent that puts a thin veneer of legality on this underlying data breach. I'm going to show you one good consent request that I've seen. This is from Cliff Hoofnagel's website. He's a professor of law at Berkeley, and at least this one is honest. The GDPR, it entered force in May 2016. It was applied in May 2018. In June 2017, IAB Europe, which represents the tracking industry's interest here, IAB Europe was lobbying the European Commission about the e-privacy regulation. And here's a letter that I obtained under Freedom of Information, which I find quite startling. In this letter, IAB Europe's representative says to the European Commission, I want you to pay careful attention to this attached document. And I'm going to show you what that attached document says. It says, because we have no idea what will happen to the data once they're sent out in real-time bidding, they say it is technically impossible for the user to have prior information about every data involved and what the hell they're going to do with the data. It is impossible for us to get consent under the GDPR. And so they were lobbying the European Commission to include some special carve-out for them, ridiculously, in the e-privacy regulation. Now that shows two things: a complete lack of interest in data protection and a very, very poor understanding of how to lobby the European Commission. A year after this, in April 2018, despite objections from myself and many others in the industry, they proceeded to launch a consent system called the Transparency and Consent Framework, which is the model for nearly all consent requests on the internet. That system is now a model for another system that is being used in California. Let me show you the Twitter account of one of the main authors who used to work for IAB Europe and claims to be one of the main authors of this system. In this person's own words, the text of that consent request is some of the most seen but least read text on the internet, and then a kind of a smiley idea about cookies. I think there's a cynicism here, and I think it's dangerous. Today, the cynicism has spread beyond the industry. The UK this morning announced, there was an embargoed statement a few days ago, announced that it has raised this consent spam issue at the G7. The UK is pretending that consent is a European problem. It's another bendy banana. It's red tape that the UK will now be free to cut through now post-Brexit. And so it has raised it as an international issue today at the G7. But I want to draw your attention, and anyone in the UK apparatus who sees this recording, to a document written by the UK's regulator on the 25th of June 2019, which our colleagues at the Global Data Review obtained under Freedom of Information. This is a note of a meeting between IAB Europe and the UK's own regulator, in which the UK's own regulator makes clear, and I draw the last speaker's attention to this, that contracts are not sufficient as a guarantee of the protection of personal data. And it explicitly mentions the RTB ecosystem here. Now that's June 2019. The ICO didn't actually take any action. The UK didn't do anything to back this up. It could and should have, it did not. In August 2019, when the IAB Europe approach was to come up with a slight modification to its consent approach, the ICO wrote back in this letter and said, no, these changes are not going to address the security issues. SCD there is special category data. It mentions information security and re-identification. Now here's why. because a data breach is necessarily a data leakage. Article 5.1f of the GDPR is incredibly clear. This is a primary principle of the data protection regulation. If you are going to orchestrate or conduct or be involved in any way, a gigantic data breach, you're not allowed to be involved in a gigantic data breach. It doesn't matter what legal basis you purport to have. That is irrelevant. You cannot ask for some lawful basis for what will be a data breach. It's very simple. And just think about how clear the GDPR is. Remember, this is based on a law that has existed since the mid-90s and is itself based on a set of principles from the 70s. But just think about the title: General Data Protection Regulation. If you cannot protect the data, you can't have the data. Now, here is what the industry says in its own words, and this is I think still, maybe they haven't taken it down yet, a public document. Pub Vendors JSON version 1. In this document, the IAB says, thousands of companies, they call them vendors in their own jargon, thousands of companies can receive the data from a single bid request. And there is no technical way to limit what the data are used for by these thousands of companies once the data are gone. In the version 2 of the IAB's Transparency and Consent Framework, they make a kind of a potential sort of maybe commitment where they say we may adopt some method at some undisclosed point in the future for trying to audit what thousands of companies have done with trillions of data about billions of people. Now, this is not a realistic claim or offer. I don't think a data protection authority could do it. I don't think there's any prospect of any entity being able to do this, having had the biggest data breach of all time every day for the last decade. Let's take a look at Google's system. If we were, as companies, to sign up to sit on Google's ad exchange, they call RTB data, that which is broadcast, call-out data. We would have to commit not to use these call-out data or real-time bidding data for various other reasons, but then they would hold us to a kind of a self-regulation of self-regulation. It would be our responsibility to tell Google when we're going to break its rules. Now, this is completely ridiculous. To remind you what the GDPR says, personal data cannot be processed in a way where you're going to have a data breach. And what the industry does is broadcast. Broadcast is an old term. It's an old verb. It goes back to before radio. It comes from very ancient agriculture. This is quite a modern practitioner. You put your hand into a basket of seeds and you scatter them on the wind and you see what happens. And that is online advertising today. And I want to tell you now some of the consequences. In our litigation against the IAB in Hamburg, one of the things you'll see, and we've made it public, is this particular piece of evidence. We do not just challenge the data breach. We challenge what is then facilitated to be done with the data after the data breach. We all know, everyone on this call, some better than others, because they may be involved, they may be facilitating it. We all know that we are tracked online, but we do not know what is done with those data, or at least we didn't until now. Because this document, the earlier version of which has now been taken down, even though it's still used, but there is a version which is pretty incriminating, which is still live on their GitHub account. This document shows us what the data broker industry does with these data. This document, Audience Taxonomy, version 1, is the Rosetta Stone that allows data brokers to trade very efficiently, it seems, large volumes of data about large numbers of people. Let me give you an example of the kind of data about all of us that end up in these hidden dossiers. And as I'm doing that, just keep remembering that you're supposed to have consented to this data breach. The kind of things that go into these dossiers include your religion. It's a long list. There's a lot of scrolling. Your religion. Are you Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, and so on? Your mental health. Are you infertile? Do you have a sexually transmitted disease? Do you want to lose weight? And the taxonomy here even gets into the most intimate things about a person, which is not them, it's their children. Do you have children with special needs? Remember, from the same people who brought you whether a person is interested in support for sexual abuse and incest recovery. So you can use this IAB code 357 to reconcile that you've just learned that this person has a child with special educational needs. What is this person's politics? And amazingly, the spelling here is a bit sus. Are they conservative, green, liberal, independent? They also want to know how much money you have in your bank account. If you have 10 grand, the code is 177, for example. Where do you work? Even things like, do you work in security, law enforcement? Do you have personal debt? And so on. This list is staggering. Bankruptcy, payday and emergency loans. It's amazing. Drugs, interests, including marijuana. Does the person gamble online or offline? Bail bonds, where do they live, and so on. Now, let me give you an example of how this affects us. There is a Polish company called, what's it called? I can't remember the name. The name has cloud in it. One of their subsidiaries is called OnAudience. This has now been changed online, but we've saved this and submitted it in evidence in some of our litigation. I went and I visited the Irish segment, and I wanted to see what kind of information these guys had on Irish people. And so they've got chronic pain, right? There's one of the tags you'll now be familiar with, and they have incest and abuse support, and you'll be familiar with that too. And you'll see that TTD, their trade desk, can provide me the opportunity to target people who are trying to recover from incest and abuse. So I want to wrap up this so that we can have conversation. And if necessary, I have bonus slides on different directions that the conversation can take. But I want to leave you with just 2 points. First, online advertising today is a massive external data free-for-all. The biggest data breach ever recorded, and it continues. It has a whole lot of what economists would call negative externalities, but the privacy one, which I focused on here, cannot be ignored. In this context, requests for spam to cover the underlying data breach, requests for consent to cover the underlying data breach are obviously spam. Now, there is more to say about the problems with the consent system, but I want to make this really, really simple. You cannot go around as a nuisance in everyone across Europe's lives and in California's now, demanding or asking them to tick boxes without actually knowing or having any indication that what they've ticked has any bearing on what actually thousands of companies will do with the data. The ICO was perfectly correct when it said contracts without any auditing, none of that stuff, are sufficient here. The data breach involved is of a scale that is mind-boggling. Hundreds of billions of these bid requests a day, and covering these with a thin veneer of legality is clearly not okay. I think once, after the summer, we have a conclusion from the Belgian enforcer before whom this issue is currently being heard, we can move on to a sensible discussion about consent. But at the moment, we're still in this window dressing or gilding of an underlying data breach that makes no sense at all. And with that, maybe we can start the conversation.